So I want to tell you all a couple of stories that I was really thinking about as I was preparing to talk about this issue of what it means to experience the derision of the world. And I want to start with a story about Galileo Galilei. So you've all heard his name before, I'm sure. He's a very famous mathematician and astronomer. He was born in 1564. And what he's really most famous for, he's made a number of really important contributions to what we call kind of classical astronomy. He was kind of at this time when there was a burgeoning technology, and so the technology of the telescope was really expanding significantly under his time. And he was a follower of this guy named Copernicus. And Copernicus had offered this really radical concept. It's called a heliocentric world, right? It's this idea that the sun is at the middle of the solar system. There wouldn't have even been a concept of a solar system before Copernicus because everything circles around the Earth, right? Just like the whole world circles around me. It's a logical conclusion, right? Everybody else is just part of the drama of my life, just like everything in the heavens is part of the drama of the Earth. And this was a predominant thought in the church. In fact, this was the thought in the church, and this concept had formed the understanding, so there was a presumption that then all the science had to work towards. And Galileo was like, I don't think so. And so he set out to find proof of this fact. And so he, as he got this better and better technology and these better telescopes, he was looking up into the sky, and he noticed something interesting when he was looking at Venus. He noticed that Venus actually had phases, like the moon does. That it went through this waxing and waning cycle. And the only way to explain that is if it was rotating around the sun. Because the other kind of structure, if everything's rotating around the Earth, then Venus wouldn't go through all of those phases. It'd only go through just a couple of them. I encourage you to look this up. It's really interesting history. The church didn't like that he was saying this, and he went on saying it for about 20 years until he finally wrote a book where he laid it out. And at this time, you didn't just write information, it was all in this dialogue. So he created these three fictional characters that were all having a conversation, and one of them represented kind of him about 20 years before, one represented him now, and one was called Simplicio, and in Italian it kind of means like simpleton or simple-minded, but that was the guy who spoke the church's opinion on things. And so you can imagine that the church wasn't super happy about this. One funny thing I heard about a sermon that was given in going against Galileo was that they had quoted the book of Acts, because Galileo, the name, actually means person from Galilee. And so Acts chapter 1, verse 11 says this. They said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up towards heaven? This Jesus who's been taken up from you into heaven is coming back the same way you saw him go into heaven." But it's this like funny, like, why are you looking up into the heavens? In fact, so much so that many of Galilee's detractors refused to look through his telescope to see these phases of Venus. They refused to look. Now this reminds me of a thing that Anita said to me a long time ago. I already know the truth. Don't confuse me with the facts. So guess what happens to Galileo? Well, this is in the 1500s, and yes, the Inquisition comes for him and says, you will either recant everything, or we have this whole slew of fun experiences awaiting you. And so he recants, and he's at 68 is put on house arrest for the rest of his life. And he lives 10 more years completely on house arrest. He publishes 2 more works that are about completely, he's like, well, I can't write about this anymore. In fact, no Catholic country was allowed to publish any of his works. And so he knew, well, I can't write about astronomy, so I'll write about things that also apply to astronomy, but I'll write about them as if I'm writing about billiards, for example, or the strength of materials. And so he wrote 2 other manifesto or kind of scientific tracts, but he had to do it carefully because he didn't want to experience all the fun things that the church had laid out for him. And when I think about this story, vehemently suspect of heresy, right? I think about how the church really sometimes is not able to get on board with encouraging wholeness. That if what loving really means is to really desire wholeness, sometimes the church really can't handle it. Sometimes we have the truth, and if it deviates, well, and I think about Jesus talking about this in the same way. If you were of the world, if you complied with the way that the world thinks, then you'd be fine and the world would love you. But the second you stop complying with that, it gets a little dicey. There's this other story I want to tell you. It's about a man by the name of Crow Dog. Now, you may not have ever heard about this man's story, but in 1881, this man was a Brule Lakota man, and he was living on a reservation in what's now South Dakota, called the Rosebud Reservation. Well, it's now called that. It was part of a much larger reservation that was ultimately broken up. There's a whole long set of stories there. I won't tell that part. But he murdered another Lakota man. Now, the backstory here is that both of these men were chiefs, were leaders within their communities, but Crow Dog was a traditionalist chief that was lifted up as kind of a sub-chief within his community, and he was understood to be a leader. He was part of the police force on the reservation. And this other man, Spotted Tail, was not actually given a leadership role by his community. He was appointed as a leader by one of the military commanders of the U.S. Army. And at the time, in 1881, there was no real federal oversight over what was happening within tribal communities. And until Crow Dog killed this man, Spotted Tail, an Indian, right, an indigenous American, had never been on trial in America for killing another indigenous person. The only way that the federal government had ever intervened is if a non-indigenous person was involved. Crimes between Native peoples were none of America's business. But when this happened, of course, it was this man who was appointed by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, seen as an assimilationist, someone who was going to do the work of getting these savages to become, good, upstanding people, and he's murdered. And so it's like, oh, one of our agents has been killed. And then they found out that within the tribal law on the Lakota reservation, Crow Dog had gone to the elders, admitted what he had done, taken responsibility for his crime, that he had killed someone, and paid restitution. He had done the work that was required by the Lakota community to kind of heal the bonds that were broken. And the federal government said, the hell with that, you have not done enough, and they arrested him, put him on trial, and of course, what were they going to do with him? They had convicted him, and they were going to hang him. They were going to hang him about 2 weeks later. And so he appealed, and he appealed to the federal courts, and they confirmed his execution, but it was delayed by a year to the day. And then he appealed to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court at the time looked at the law, looked at the treaty obligations that existed, and said, you know what? Actually, the tribes have sovereignty here. This is a tribal issue between two tribal members, and they have the explicit right under treaty law to decide what the punishment should be. And so the case was thrown out. And about 3 months later, legislation was passed by the United States government that stripped that sovereignty from indigenous nations. That because indigenous nations were actually trustees of the United States government, because they couldn't really be trusted to be moral and come up with honest ways of being civilized people, that their sovereignty over major crimes had to be removed. And so the Major Crimes Act of 1885, I believe, was initiated. That was the beginning of really undercutting all of indigenous sovereignty and jurisprudence from there forward. And it was 8 crimes before, now it's 15. And that was really the beginning of really demonstrating to indigenous peoples, you don't even really have, I mean, there's treaties, but really you're subjects, not citizens. And that was based, again, in this notion that was predominant within Christianity about how we view those who are outside, those who disagree, who do things differently. But somehow it wasn't even this compassionate response, right? It was this desire for this eye for an eye, almost justice. And if love is the desire for wholeness, for flourishing, sometimes these beliefs that we have can get in the way. When I think about the world, right, this concept of the world can really go against loving people, because the world can teach us things like we know better. The world can teach us things like those ideas are bad ideas and they're dangerous and they lead to problems, and so we got to shut those people up. We got to take away their rights. We got to limit them because we know better. And I think about somehow our narrative about ourselves and our life and do that same thing. I'm strong, therefore I should be able to endure this. I'm not going to complain. I'm not going to talk about my pain. I'm going to get to the point where I am literally falling apart caring for someone else because I'm a strong person and I should be able to do that. Or I'm brave, so I'm going to risk myself foolishly. I'm not even going to think about it ahead of time. Every identity marker we have about ourselves has a shadow side to it. That it can be extended, overextended, it can go too far, it can become a problem for us. And I think we're at the point now in Christian society, in the growth of the church, where we really need to honor that self-denial, that self-sacrifice is becoming one of those problems within Christianity. That this idea that service means that you don't matter and other people matter more than you has become such a toxic narrative that is directly associated with how we think about Jesus. Thank God Jesus loves you, and he died for you, and you should feel really bad about it, and therefore you should give up your life just like he did. And what I think that does is I think it impoverishes the experience of the cross and the death of Jesus. Because who put him on the cross? Did we? Is it because we're so terrible? Is it because God is so mad at us that he had to be murdered in order to fix the problem? Or did he go to the cross because he was unwilling to capitulate with the systems of domination and control and oppression? He was willing to say everybody matters. And this system of hierarchy, the system of power, is undermining the belief that people matter because people are becoming objects. People are becoming means to an end. And that's wrong. And all the people that are standing on top of all those people are saying, oh no, if everybody at the bottom starts believing this, what happens? It falls apart, which is great for the people at the bottom, and less great for the people at the top. I think that the self-denial is something that empire wants us to believe because it allows us to stay in these toxic places. It allows us to justify to ourselves that we deserve less than belovedness. We deserve less than care and compassion. Other people deserve that, but not us. And I think the teachings of Jesus are fundamentally against these concepts. At other times, we've had to learn different things. With Galileo, we had to learn that maybe the way we see the world needs to start with experiencing God and God's creation, rather than limiting God to a set of notions. With Crow Dog, maybe we had to learn that our assumptions about what's just, maybe we need to start by looking at what are the relationships that are maintained and cared for, rather than what is the righteous outcome. Because maybe the righteous outcome is distracting us from that ability to love and be in relationship. And I think today, this self-denial, this sense that we're not enough, that we need to always be of service to someone else instead of be of service to making this space where all of us can flourish and thrive. Maybe that's the thing we need to get over, get through. Maybe that's the thing that needs to die. Because I believe that Jesus calls us to be more together.